So welcome to part 2 of my video lessons on the respiratory system. We are living in this COVID world, and so all of my lessons are being done virtual so that when we actually meet on Google Meet or face-to-face, we can actually talk about what you learned and do different activities and different experiments as opposed to just me teaching you. But in the first video, we talked about what we consider to be the upper respiratory system. And the upper respiratory system is often considered to be your nose, your mouth, your pharynx, your larynx, which is your voice box, and your trachea. So what we're going to focus on in this one is mostly what we call the lower respiratory system, which are basically your lungs. Now, I am sitting outside. It is a beautiful autumn day. And so you might hear the dogs barking, you might hear the kids running around, you might hear the wind chimes going off. But in the case of our lower respiratory system, we have a series of tubes. And please keep in mind, every time that a tube divides or a tube splits, it gets a little bit smaller and a little bit smaller and a little bit smaller. And so we start off with what we call our windpipe. And our windpipe is our trachea. And we have one trachea. It is made of hyaline cartilage. These rings of cartilage are there to basically keep our trachea open. We don't want our trachea to collapse. We don't want to bend our head and squeeze our trachea shut, just like you take a garden hose and bend it to stop water from flowing. We need to make sure that we're still breathing. But we have two lungs. So down at the bottom of the trachea, it does split into two smaller tubes. And you can see this here. We have what we call the left bronchus, and you have what we call the right bronchus. Now, bronchi is the plural. And you can see in this picture that they are smaller tubes, one going to each lung. Now, once they're inside the lungs, they're going to continue to split and continue to split into these smaller tubes that you'll see here. Okay? Those are what we call your bronchioli. You have hundreds to maybe even thousands of those inside of your lungs. I don't know the exact number, and I'm not going to lie and make it up. And then they continue to split into even smaller tubes that are called the alveolar ducts. And at the bottom of the alveolar ducts, you can have these little bubbles called alveoli. You can kind of see them in this drawing. Well, your alveoli are made of simple squamous tissue. If you remember, simple means it's just one layer. Squamous means they're flat. This is the thinnest type of epithelial tissue you can have. And this is because this is where gas exchange has to take place. And we talked about in the lungs, we have what's called external respiration. This is where oxygen is going to leave the lung tissue and enter the bloodstream, and carbon dioxide is going to leave the bloodstream and come into your lungs. Now, I always tend to think of the lungs as being a cluster of grapes. Because when you go to the store, nowadays, you just don't buy a cluster of grapes. You buy a cluster of grapes wrapped in a package. Well, our lungs are organs. And remember, every organ in your body has a membrane that goes around it. And you can see that membrane here in the drawing, right there. That membrane is called the pleural, just like the word, it's called the pleura. Okay? And it is a double membrane. It has the parietal layer, which will be the layer if you could touch the lung, that would be the layer touching. And then underneath that, you have the visceral layer, and it does have that layer of fluid called the pleural fluid in between it. But we do have this membrane that goes around it. So think of that as the sac that you buy your grapes in. And then, ta-da, when you reach in to pull out your grapes, you know that you have this long stem right there. That would be like the bronchi tube. That would be the tube that branches off of your trachea, and then it will begin to split. And as you look at your cluster of grapes, you have even more smaller tubes. Those would be like the bronchioles. And then branching off the bronchioles, you have this even smaller tube. It's basically like the stem that holds the grape on, and that would be your alveolar duct. And you can think of the grape as being your alveoli itself. So in the case of the lungs, this again is just another artist's drawing of what the lungs look like. Your lungs have no muscle. Think of them as empty balloons. Most organs in our body contain smooth muscle, things like anything that has a tube in it, like our kidneys have smooth muscles in the nephrons, our livers have smooth muscles in the hepatic duct. Okay? Our lungs have no muscles in them whatsoever. They cannot do anything for themselves. A balloon cannot blow up by himself. So therefore, we have different muscles such as our diaphragm and our intercostal muscles that allow us to breathe. Now, as you can see in this picture, remember, pictures are always drawn as if you're looking down on yourself. So this side here is the right side, and this side here is the left side. And you can see from this picture that the right lung is actually larger than the left lung. Okay. The right lung has 3 lobes. You can see them numbered here. Here is 1, 2, and 3. Can't really see my 3 very well. Let's change that to black. Okay. We have 1, 2, and 3. And our left lung only has 2 lobes. And the reason for that is because our heart sits right there in the middle. And our heart is more on the left side than it is on the right side. And so we need to have a room, we need to have a space for our heart. And again, the formal definition of the lungs is a collective alveolar sac surrounded by the double membrane called the pleura, which is what I talked about before. Okay. The alveolar sacs, think of them as soap bubbles. That's how thin they are. Okay. And so that's why we have to be real careful and make sure our air is really, really, really filtered. Imagine having a soap bubble with a particle of sand in it. As that sand rolls around, you know it's going to pop that soap bubble. Well, we don't want these little bubbles inside of our lungs popping, or else we wouldn't be able to breathe. So we do have this membrane around them. It's called the pleura. And the other picture, you could see the pleura, but here they just kind of drew it down here at the bottom, just to give you an idea that it's there. And like most other organs, or all organs in your body, every organ in your body has a membrane that goes around it. And in the case of our lungs, that membrane is called the pleura. And that membrane always has at least 2 layers. Remember, the outside layer is always called the parietal layer, and the inside layer is always called the visceral layer. And they'll always have a fluid between them to keep the layers from sticking together. And in the case of the lungs, this is called the pleural fluid. Now, it is possible for this tissue to get infected, which can cause certain problems. You guys know infections can lead to pus buildup. Pus is basically a byproduct of your immune system. It's basically the fallen soldiers. It's dead white blood cells, and it's also dead bacteria, dead viruses, whatever it is that is being fought by our bodies. So if pus begins to fill up or begins to form in this space, it's called epema. Now, sometimes you can have damage to the lungs, or you can have damage to the pleural tissue itself. And remember, one of the things of the immune system is that when we have an inflammation response, things start to swell. So what can happen if the lungs start to swell or the tissues start to swell? Remember, our body makes this pleural tissue or this pleural fluid to keep our tissues from touching, and it reduces friction. So if I have a layer of tissue here and this other tissue begins to swell, your body is going to go in and pump more fluid into that space in order to keep those tissues separated, or to keep those 2 layers of tissue separated. Well, that's going to put pressure on your lungs. And this is a situation called thoracentesis. So you can actually get too much fluid in the space, which would be basically, if you were the lung, you're lying on the ground, and I start putting a bunch of water balloons on you. It will put pressure on the lungs, and that lung's going to have a harder time functioning. So what doctors have to do sometimes in extreme cases, they'll go in with a shunt, and a shunt is basically a drainage tube. And they can go in and place that drainage tube somewhere in the pleura and drain some of that fluid out. They can then test that fluid to see what's showing up in it. Is it bacteria? Is it virus? Is there blood in that fluid? And at the same time, they can actually, in extreme cases, pump IV antibiotics in order to help fight the infection. Now, I wanted to show you, this is a picture of healthy lungs here on the left. So you can see the trachea, you can see the bronchial tubes, and you can see what lung tissue actually looks like. And then I wanted to show you what the lungs of a cigarette smoker and the lungs of a marijuana smoker look like. Now, cigarette smoke has tar in it, and tar is tar. I mean, it's what we use to pave roads with. You know, roads are black. Smoke is black. Smoke has ash in it. So you can see what cigarette smoke does to your lungs. And people might say, well, I don't smoke, I vape. It has the same chemicals in it, just without the smoke, pretty much. And you can see what the lungs of a marijuana smoker look like. Now, in the case of your lungs, again, we have gas exchange between the blood and the alveoli. And so here you can see the bronchial tube. Okay? And here you can see where it has split into your smaller alveolar ducts. And then we have this alveoli right here. And the alveoli is not opaque, as it shows here. Your alveoli is simple squamous tissue, so it's very, very, very thin, just like a soap bubble. And our lungs, again, are pink because of all the blood vessels that we have going to that tissue. And this is where our external respiration is going to take place. Remember, when we talk about respiration, external respiration is not breathing out. External respiration is carbon dioxide leaving the bloodstream. So as you can see down here in this diagram, this shows you that oxygen will leave the lungs and go into the bloodstream, and carbon dioxide will leave the bloodstream and come into the lungs. And this is all based on what we call the partial pressure of oxygen. So if you take AP biology later on, or you go into med school or nursing school and take a more advanced form of anatomy, they're going to talk more about that. I'm going to skip it. So then it leads us to, why do we breathe? Now, all of your life, you're probably like, yeah, because we need oxygen. Well, yeah, that's right. We do need oxygen. But we use oxygen in a process that we call cellular respiration. Oxygen is needed by all cells to take sugar and break it down into this gasoline our cells need called ATP. And if oxygen's available, we can do aerobic respiration. And for one piece of sugar, we get 36 molecules of ATP. That's like trading one candy bar for 36 gallons of gas. However, our cells can get by without oxygen. Don't like it, and it's going to be damaging, but it is possible. But believe it or not, there's nothing in your body that can really measure how much oxygen is available. However, we can measure carbon dioxide. So in all honesty, you do not breathe due to the lack of oxygen. Your brain doesn't really have a way of knowing how much oxygen you have in your tissue, but it can measure pH. You breathe to get rid of carbon dioxide. When carbon dioxide is mixed with water, you make what's called carboxyl acid. So right now, flowing through your bloodstream is carboxyl acid. It's an acid, we gotta get rid of it. Well, our blood is not a neutral pH. Our blood's pH is normally around 7.4, which if you remember, your pH scale is a base. Well, the reason for that is because carboxyl acid is an acid. And you know, if you mix acids and bases together, it neutralizes it. So by having an acidic substance in our bloodstream needs to be a little bit basic in order to counteract that. However, the more carbon dioxide that builds up in our bloodstream, the more we drop below 7. And our brain can register that. It's a portion of our brain called the medulla oblongata. Since CO2, when mixed with water, is an acid, it's going to build up in the blood and the pH of the blood will drop. That will then trigger your medulla oblongata to tell you to breathe out. So your brain actually tells you, hey, you need to get rid of carbon dioxide. And that gives us the process of breathing in and breathing out that we're used to. So in the case of the respiratory cycle, this diagram is a little wordy, and believe it or not, the process of breathing is not very difficult. We have this thing called the diaphragm. And the diaphragm is this curved muscle that lies underneath our rib cage. It is smooth muscle. Well, if you remember, one of the traits of smooth muscle is that it peristalsis. It's peristalsis fairly slowly, but in the case of our diaphragm, it's usually curved, and then it will flatten, and then it curves back up, and then it flattens. And that's going to cause our respiratory cycle. Now, at the same time, we have these muscles called the intercostal muscles. These are rib cage muscles. Now, they're skeletal muscle, but they can be triggered by the brain, and they're going to help with your breathing. And remember, we control skeletal muscle. It's voluntary. This is why we can hold our breath. So when you hold your breath, you're actually stopping the intercostals from working, but your diaphragm is still going to go up and down to try to get you to breathe anyway. But in the case of breathing in, this is all done by pressure changes. Remember, your lungs have no muscle in them at all. So we have to get the lungs to fill up, just as if you were blowing into a balloon. So when the diaphragm is relaxed, it is curved, as you can see here in picture 1. But when the diaphragm begins to peristalse, the diaphragm, as you can see in picture 2, begins to drop down. Well, when the diaphragm drops down, that's going to create a suction, and that will suck air down into your lungs. At the same time, as you can see right here, that will trigger your intercostal muscles to contract, and that will pull your rib cage outward. So that would be like you taking a balloon and pulling it open. That's going to create even more suction, and that's going to suck even more air in. That's what we call negative pressure, because we're not pushing on the lungs, we're pulling on the lungs. So that negative pressure is going to cause air to rush down inside of our lungs. The opposite happens when we want to breathe out, which is expiration. This is called positive pressure because we are going to push on the lungs. You can see here that the diaphragm is going to curve back up. When the diaphragm curves back up, that's going to push on the lungs. It'd be like you having a balloon in one hand and you take your other hand and you start to push on the balloon. That's going to help push air out. At the same time, your rib cage will begin to drop back down, and it's like you sitting on a balloon. That's going to push air out. So that's what we call positive pressure, because you're actually pushing on the lungs. And that's going to be how we get oxygen, or how we get carbon dioxide out of our body. Which leads us to a lot of words. This is basically the same thing I just said. So if you want to pause this video at any point in time to read the formal definition of it, there you go. Now, remember, breathing is involuntary. It is controlled by your diaphragm. And like all muscles, sometimes your diaphragm might get a little spasm in it. So it bounces up and down, up and down, up and down, and that's what gives you the hiccups. But in the case of breathing, it is involuntary. It's controlled by the medulla, which is a portion of your brainstem, and the diaphragm. Again, is smooth muscle. It's involuntary. Okay. When you hold your breath, you stop the intercostals from moving, but not the diaphragm. And as you hold your breath, carbon dioxide will build up in your bloodstream, and your brain is going to regulate that. And eventually, the pH levels will drop so much that your brain takes over. And so as the CO2 builds up in your blood, the medulla is going to take over and it will cause that person to pass out. Well, as soon as that person passes out, they breathe out, when they will then immediately turn around and breathe right back in and get rid of that carbon dioxide. Your first breath. Well, you guys all know it's very important to hear a baby cry when they're born. Well, think about it. When you were a fetus, you were in this nice warm bath, and it was dark and it was quiet and you were rocking around, and then all of a sudden you're born. And all of a sudden you have this bright light. You've never seen light before. You hear sounds that you've never heard before, and it's cold. And these ugly creatures are looking at you for the very first time. And that scares you. And think about what you do when somebody startles you. So for your first breath, as a fetus, your lungs are actually flat. You are not breathing as a fetus. You don't want to fill them up with fluid. It'd be like you breathing underwater. So when you're born, you get startled, and so you gasp. And when you gasp, you fill your lungs with air. Now, your lungs do have some fluid in it. Sometimes, like when I go to the beach and I've been in the water for a long period of time, if I take a deep breath, it hurts. That's because I've actually inhaled water down into my lungs. Now, I haven't actually stuck my face underwater, but just condensation, evaporation from the ocean, I breathe it in and it causes condensation to form inside my lungs. And when you take a deep breath, you can actually push that fluid out of your lung tissue. Well, when the child does that for the very first time, they're going to push any fluid out of their lungs, and that hurts, and they're scared, and they start to cry. So this is why you want to hear a baby cry, because you know that it's taking its first breath. Now, some of you are going to become paramedics, you're going to become doctors, and you might work in an emergency room. And unfortunately, people are going to come in with chest injuries. Well, one of the things that you need to watch for is something called pneumothorax. Pneuma is the Greek word for air, and thorax is your chest. This is basically air in your chest. What happens in this case is when you breathe in, air goes into your lungs, and yes, your lungs are in the chest, but that's not what's happening here. Sometimes an accident puts a hole through the chest cavity. Unfortunately, maybe somebody gets shot, or there might be a chance where they're impaled. This is why it's very important. If you ever have a chest injury, don't take it out. Okay? If somebody were to get stabbed, or somebody would have something go into their chest, it's just reflex to go in and try and pull it out. Don't do that. Because as long as that piece is in there, you've got yourself a plug. If you pull that out, you can create what's called a sucking wound, or you can cause what's called pneumothorax. If we have an opening in the chest cavity that is deep enough, as the diaphragm goes up and down, that will start sucking air in through the opening, not down through the trachea. So this air will fill up in the chest, hence the term pneumothorax, or air in the chest. Okay? We don't want that to happen. This is also called a sucking wound because you will hear it sucking air in through the chest, and you will see bubbles forming as air gets compressed out. If this is ever the case, you need to do the best that you can in order to plug that hole. Don't worry about infection. we have antibiotics, we can take care of that. Okay. You just need to get that hole plugged as fast as you can. You can put your hand on it. You can actually, some people take newspaper and wet the newspaper and stick it on there. If you have honey, honey is an excellent antibiotic. You can take a piece of paper and put honey on it to cover that up. Anything to try to stop that. Because if you allow that air to continue to build up, you can cause the lung to collapse itself. These are just some disorders of the respiratory system. Asthma tends to be an autoimmune disorder. Autoimmune means your own body is causing the damage in some way, shape, or form. And it tends to be due to the swelling of bronchial tubes. So in the case of asthma, which we've all heard of, instead of having this nice tube to breathe through, that tube condenses and gets really, really, really small. You might have heard of apnea, specifically sleep apnea. This is when you temporarily stop breathing, that should say for no reason at all. That's a typo on my part. Dyspnea is difficult or labored breathing. Now that's not you've exercised, you have a hard time breathing. That's like people who smoke or people who have lung disease or other things that are happening. Cystic fibrosis is a genetic disorder in which large amounts of mucus fill up the lung tissue. And so they're going to have a harder time breathing. And then there's something called Cheyne-Stokes, which is a period of dyspnea followed by apnea. This is one of the signs that death is close because the person will slowly slow down their breathing, but it'll be labored breathing. It's like they're having a hard time breathing, and then they'll periodically stop breathing for a period of time. Then they'll start breathing again, and then they'll periodically stop breathing. And the time between breaths gets longer and longer and longer each time until they don't take their next breath. Now, there's a lot of words here, but I'm just going to make it really easy for you. And this is one of the last things that we're going to talk about. When we talk about how much air goes into your lungs, you'll see the term tidal volume. Now, you guys all know the tides. You have high tide, you have low tide. It's in and out, in and out. What you would call normal breathing is your tidal volume. So how much air you take in a normal breath is about equal to how much air you take out in a normal breath. And so this is what we call your tidal volume. Now, that's different from complemental air and supplemental air. When you take the deepest breath you can, you breathe in till you cannot breathe in anymore. That's what we call complemental air. And that is about 3 liters worth of air. Then if you turn around and breathe out till you can't breathe out anymore, that's called supplemental air. But you only can breathe out about 2 liters. You always have at least half a liter in each lung to keep your lung tissue from sticking together. And that air that's always found in your lungs is what we call the residual air or the residual volume. And then just remember the respiratory system in the medulla oblongata, it establishes your basic breathing patterns. We have chemical receptors that monitor our carbon dioxide levels, our oxygen levels, and we'll talk about the medulla more when we do the nervous system.